Why were 8 cowboys obsessed with the stable boy? The good boy bunkhouse story, Cowboy Secrets. He said it so quietly that I almost missed it. Standing in the middle of the bunkhouse, surrounded by 8 hard-edged cowboys who'd gone completely silent, Cade Harlow looked directly at me, only at me, and whispered 2 words, "Don't go." And in that single heartbeat, I understood that everything between us had already changed forever. The question was, did he know it too? The morning I arrived at the Double H Ranch, the sun hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to rise. It hung there, orange and reluctant, behind a ridge of blue-gray mountains in the eastern distance, painting the sky in colors so violent and beautiful that I had to pull my old truck over on the dirt road and simply stare. I'd driven 11 hours straight from Phoenix, duffel bag in the back seat, savings in a sealed envelope in the glove compartment, and one contact name written on a folded piece of paper in my shirt pocket: Hugh Harlow, Double H Ranch, Sutter Creek, Montana. I was 22 years old. I had grown up in the suburbs of Arizona, knew more about fixing Wi-Fi routers than fixing fence lines, and had never once saddled a horse in my entire life. What I did have, apparently, was a stubborn streak wide enough to drive a cattle truck through, and a letter of reference from Dr. Anita Wells at the Maricopa County Equine Therapy Center, where I'd volunteered 3 years and learned that the thing I was best at in this world was understanding animals. Horses specifically, the way they breathed, the way they shifted their weight when they were nervous, the way their ears tracked sound before their eyes ever moved. Dr. Wells had called it a rare instinct. She said some people are born knowing how to be still in a way that animals trust. She said I was one of them. I'd clung to that compliment like a life raft for the past 11 hours of driving. When I finally turned down the long gravel lane toward the Double H, my headlights swept across a wooden archway with iron letters bolted across the top, and beneath it, a world that felt like it belonged to a different century. Wooden fencing ran in long, clean lines across rolling fields. A white farmhouse sat on a low hill, its windows already glowing with warm yellow light. And stretching out behind it, enormous, dark, and smelling even from here of hay and leather, and something deep and earthy that I couldn't name, were the stables. I parked next to a row of other trucks, all of them battered and work-scarred in ways that made mine look brand new. I sat there for a moment with the engine ticking in the cold morning air, hands on the steering wheel, telling myself the thing I'd been telling myself since I left Phoenix. You needed a change. This is a change. You're fine. I grabbed my duffel, got out, and walked toward the light. Hugh Harlow was not what I expected. I had imagined a gruff, weathered man in his 60s who would look me up and down and immediately regret hiring me. Instead, the man who opened the farmhouse door was somewhere in his mid-40s, with an easy smile and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, holding a mug of coffee in each hand as if he'd been expecting company. "Eli Vance," he said. "Yes, sir." "You look younger in person." He handed me one of the coffees before I could protest. "Come in. I'll give you the tour before the others wake up. It's better that way, quieter." The farmhouse kitchen smelled like coffee and pine and something baking. Hugh Harlow sat across from me at a long wooden table and talked with the easy confidence of a man who had run this place for 20 years and trusted his own judgment completely. He told me about the ranch, a working cattle operation with 63 horses spread across 3 separate stables. He told me about the 8 hands who lived in the bunkhouse, 3 of whom had been at the Double H for over a decade. He told me that the previous stable manager, a man named Pete Dawson, had left suddenly 2 weeks ago for family reasons, and that while most of the hands could cover the work between them, none of them had the specific animal handling patience that the horses needed. "Dr. Wells says you do," he said, looking at me steadily over the rim of his mug. "I hope she's right," I said. He studied me for a moment, then he nodded once as if something had been settled. "She usually is. I've known Anita for 20 years. He set his mug down. "One thing you should know before you meet the crew, Eli, they're good men, hard workers, every one of them, but they are," he paused, searching for the word, "traditional. Some of them have been ranching since they were old enough to walk. This is their world. You come in from the outside, you come in younger than most of them, and you're going to be given charge of animals they've worked with for years. That's going to create friction. Expect it. Don't let it knock you off your footing. I nodded. I understand. He stood up, which I took as the end of the welcome speech. Good. I'll show you the stables first, then I'll take you to the bunkhouse. He paused at the door and looked back at me with something that was almost amusement. Oh, and one more thing. My nephew lives on the property. He helps out with the horses when he can. He's been covering the stable work since Pete left. He said this carefully, in a tone I couldn't quite read. His name is Cade. He's a little particular about the horses. Just be patient with him. I said I would. I had no idea, in that moment, what being patient with Cade Harlow was actually going to cost me. The stables at the Double H were the most beautiful working stables I had ever seen. That might not sound like high praise, given that I was 22 and had mostly worked in a county equine therapy center, but I mean it with full sincerity. Hugh Harlow had built them with the same attention to detail that someone else might give a home. Wide stalls, clean light, good ventilation. The smell was honest, hay and animal and warm wood, without the undertone of neglect that I'd noticed in some of the facilities I'd volunteered at. The horses here were cared for. You could feel it in the way they stood in their stalls, calm and curious rather than anxious. Hugh walked me through the main stable at just past 6 in the morning, namming each horse as we passed, noting their temperaments and quirks the way a person might introduce family members. There was Duchess, a 17-year-old bay mare who was retired from cattle work and needed daily walking. There was Captain, a massive grey gelding who was the ranch's primary working horse and who, Hugh told me, had once kicked a fence post clean out of the ground when something startled him. There was Maple and Rio, and a young chestnut filly named Sable who had arrived 3 months ago and was still, in Hugh's words, finding her confidence. I was taking notes in a small spiral notebook, actual handwritten notes, which seemed to mildly impress Hugh when I heard the sound. Soft, low, barely audible over the ambient noise of the stable. Someone talking, not to Hugh, not to me, to one of the horses. I looked up. At the far end of the stable, in the stall that housed Sable the young chestnut filly, a man was leaning against the wooden partition with his arms folded over the top rail, speaking in a voice so quiet that I couldn't make out the words. Just the rhythm of them, slow, steady, unhurried, like water moving over smooth stone. Sable had her nose inches from his face, her dark eyes half closed, her whole body in an attitude of absolute trust. Hugh stopped walking. He looked at the scene, then back at me, and something in his expression softened slightly. "That's Cade," he said. I looked at Cade Harlow for the first time. He was, I would be lying if I said my mind catalogued him the way you catalogue a stranger. He was tall, broad-shouldered in that particular way that comes from actual physical work rather than a gym. Dark hair under a worn grey hat, pushed back enough that I could see his face in profile. A strong jaw, the shadow of a beard, hands that were rough and scarred at the knuckles in the way that working hands get. He looked about my age, maybe a year or two older. He was wearing a faded blue shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the morning cold, and worn leather gloves tucked into the back pocket of his jeans. He hadn't noticed us, or I realized a moment later he had noticed us and was simply choosing not to acknowledge it yet, the way a person might when they're in the middle of something important. Hugh called out, "Cade." Cade turned, and that was the first time I saw his eyes, a dark, steady amber brown, the kind of color that looked different depending on the light, and in the early morning glow of the stable, they caught something warm. His expression was composed, reserved. He looked at Hugh first, then shifted his gaze to me, and something moved across his face that I couldn't read, quick as a shadow, gone before I could name it. "This is Eli Vance," Hugh said, "the new stable manager I told you about." Cade said nothing for a moment. He looked at me with the kind of steady, measuring look that you rarely get from strangers, the kind that doesn't look away and doesn't apologize for looking. It wasn't rude. It was just direct, like he was deciding something. "You worked with horses before," he said. His voice was lower than I'd expected. Even out of whisper range, it had that same quality, unhurried level, like every word had been considered before it was spoken. At an equine therapy center in Arizona, I said. 3 years. Therapy horses, not a question, a slight shift in his tone, not dismissive exactly, but reserving judgment. And before that I grew up going to my cousin's quarter horse farm in New Mexico every summer, I said. I'm not going to pretend I have your experience, but I'm not walking in blind. That surprised him. I could see it, just barely, just a slight recalibration behind his eyes. Then he nodded once, slow, and turned back to Sable without another word. Hugh, beside me, made a small sound that might have been approval. I'll let you two get acquainted, he said. Eli, the bunkhouse is the long red building on the east side of the property. I'll introduce you to the crew at breakfast, 7:30 sharp. He walked out, and I was left standing in the middle of the main stable at 6 in the morning with Cade Harlow and 60-odd horses, and the quiet that comes right before a day begins. I didn't know what to do with the silence, so I did the obvious thing. I walked to the nearest stall and introduced myself to the horse. This was Captain, the grey gelding, who swung his enormous head in my direction and regarded me with what I can only describe as skeptical royalty. I held the back of my hand up to his nose. He sniffed it. He did not appear impressed. He doesn't like fast movements, Cade said from down the aisle. He still hadn't looked at me. I can see that, I said. He's wound pretty tight right now. A pause. He's always like this in the morning. No, I said. This is more than morning energy. Something spooked him recently, maybe in the last few days. He's still carrying it. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. I turned and found Cade looking at me now fully, without pretense. He was standing in the opening of Sable's stall, one hand on the gate post, studying me with an expression I still couldn't read. There was a storm 3 nights ago, he said. Lightning hit the ridge. He was the only horse that didn't settle afterward. I turned back to Captain and kept my hand steady near his nose, letting him make the choice. Has he been eating normally? Mostly. I'll spend some extra time with him this morning, before the others come in. Another pause, then, you don't have to do that on your first day. I know, I said, I want to. I heard Cade move, the soft shift of boots on hay-covered floor, and then he was standing beside me, closer than I expected, close enough that I was suddenly very aware of the warmth that came off him in the cool morning air. He reached past me and laid his hand flat on Captain's neck, and the horse let out a long, slow breath. He responds to pressure, Cade said quietly, not restraint, just presence. I know how that feels, I said. I meant it as a throwaway comment, the kind of thing you say without thinking, but the moment it left my mouth it hung in the air between us with more weight than I intended. Cade went still for just a fraction of a second. Then he stepped back, and the space between us was normal again. Breakfast is at 7:30, he said. Don't be late. Hector makes the eggs, and he takes it personally if they go cold. He walked out of the stable without looking back. I stood there in the grey morning light, hands still raised near Captain's nose, feeling the ghost of that brief closeness like a warmth that hadn't faded yet. Particular, Hugh had said. Yeah, I was starting to understand. The bunkhouse at the Double H was exactly what the name suggested. A long, low-ceilinged building with 8 beds arranged in 2 rows, a communal bathroom, and at one end, a living area with a wood stove, a beat-up couch, a card table, and a shelf of paperback westerns that looked like they'd been there since the 1980s. It was clean, though. Surprisingly so. Someone took care of this place. By the time I'd dropped my duffel on the empty bed nearest the door, apparently the unspoken custom for newcomers, and made it to the main farmhouse for breakfast at 7:28, the crew was already assembled. 8 men around a long table, and they all looked up when I walked in. I had been warned about friction. What I hadn't been warned about was the specific quality of 8 working cowboys simultaneously sizing up a new arrival over scrambled eggs. It wasn't hostile. It was just thorough. Hugh introduced me simply, Eli Vance, your new stable manager. Treat him the same way you'd want to be treated on your first day. Then he sat down and poured himself coffee, which I took as the end of the formal portion. I sat in the one empty seat, naturally the one in the most exposed position at the midpoint of the table, and within about 30 seconds I had catalogued the crew the way you do when you're new somewhere and social survival depends on reading the room fast. There was Hector Muniz, who was indeed at the stove and who did indeed take the eggs personally. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, compact and quick-moving, with a gold ring on his right hand and the easy authority of a man who had been cooking for large groups long enough that he'd stopped asking permission. He gave me a nod that felt like a provisional acceptance. There was Bobby Crane, easily the oldest of the crew, late 50s, grey at the temples, with the kind of sun-carved face that comes from decades outdoors. He studied me over his coffee mug with eyes that were sharp and not unkind. There was Terence Walsh, who was enormous, 6'4" at least, built like a barn door, with a wide, easy grin that made him instantly likable. "You the one who's gonna finally get Rio to stop biting?" he said, by way of greeting. I told him I'd do my best. He laughed. That seemed to be enough. There was Marcus Webb, young, maybe 20, making him the second youngest at the table after me, with quick dark eyes and an energy that couldn't quite stay still. He kept bouncing one knee under the table. He reminded me of a horse that needed more exercise than it was getting. There was Danny Frost, who had the sleepy, unhurried manner of a man who conserved energy the way the land conserved water, carefully, and only releasing it when absolutely necessary. He barely looked up from his plate. There was Gil Ramirez, who I clocked immediately as the one who was going to give me the hardest time, not out of malice, but out of principle. He had the kind of crossed arms energy that said, "Prove it." He'd been at the Double H 11 years, I would later learn, and he regarded any newcomer as a potential disruption until demonstrated otherwise. There was Owen Tate, lean and red-haired, who seemed perpetually amused by something, as if the world were a long joke he'd been in on from the beginning. He introduced himself by saying, "So you're the one who's supposed to handle Sable. Good luck. That horse hates everyone." And then there was Cade. He was already seated when I came in, at the far end of the table near the window. He had taken off his hat, and the morning light came through the glass and caught the dark of his hair, and he was looking at something outside with that same quality of stillness I'd noticed in the stable, as if the noise of the room around him was simply a weather pattern he existed in without being moved by. When I sat down, his gaze shifted to me briefly, then back to the window. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He was the kind of presence in a room that said things without speaking. Breakfast was loud and warm and full of the overlapping conversations of men who knew each other's rhythms. I mostly listened. I ate Hector's eggs, which were genuinely excellent. I answered the questions that were directed at me. Where was I from? What had I done before? Did I follow any college football? And I let the ones that were clearly tests go by without getting defensive. When Gil said, "Therapy horses," with a particular emphasis that was designed to invite a reaction, I just nodded and said, "That's right. You'd be surprised what you learn about horse behavior from working with animals that can't afford to be spooked." Gil looked at me. Bobby, across the table, made a small sound into his coffee. I thought I saw the corner of Cade's mouth move, but when I looked, he was still watching the window, expression unchanged. After breakfast, Hugh laid out the day's assignments. The crew dispersed. I followed Cade back to the stables. Not because anyone told me to, just because that's where I was going, and that's where he was going, and it seemed like the natural thing. He didn't comment on it. Here is how my first month at the Double H went. I learned the horses, all of them, one by one, slowly, carefully, their preferences and their fears, the sounds they made when they were content, and the ones they made when something was wrong. I learned that Captain responded to low humming and hated the smell of diesel. I learned that Maple was jealous of Sable and needed extra attention when they were worked in proximity. I learned that Rio, who everyone warned me about, was not actually aggressive. He was bored, and bored horses behave like frustrated teenagers, which meant what he needed was more stimulation and a consistent handler who didn't flinch. He stopped biting within 2 weeks. Terence acted like I had performed a miracle. I learned the crew. Bobby was the quiet authority who the others deferred to in Hugh's absence. Hector was the emotional center of the bunkhouse. He celebrated birthdays, remembered preferences, settled small disputes with food. Marcus was genuinely talented with cattle work, but impatient with horses. Danny was the opposite, slow and methodical with animals, terrifyingly fast at everything mechanical. Gil tested me for about 3 weeks straight with increasingly obscure technical questions about horse care, and when he finally ran out of questions he couldn't trip me on, he stopped testing me and started talking to me like a person. That felt like a significant victory. And Cade. I learned Cade in the way that you learn something that doesn't come with instructions, slowly, accidentally, in pieces. He was Hugh's nephew, I already knew that. What I didn't know until Hector told me one evening was that Cade had been living and working at the Double H since he was 16, brought there, as Hector told it without editorializing, after some trouble at home. He'd grown up on this land as much as anywhere. The horses were his, in the way that things become yours not through ownership, but through the accumulation of daily care. He knew every one of them by name and personality and history. He'd been the one to receive Sable when she arrived, scared and skittish, and he'd been the one to sit with her for 3 hours on her first night until she stopped shaking. He was 23, 1 year older than me. He worked harder than anyone on the property, except maybe Hugh. He was up before dawn every day without exception, and I started getting up before dawn too, partly because my body adjusted to the rhythm of the ranch, and partly because I told myself it was about the horses, and partly, if I'm being honest, because I wanted those quiet early mornings in the stable before the rest of the world woke up. Those mornings became something, I don't know what to call them even now. We'd work side by side in the half-dark, moving through the stalls, doing the first checks of the day, and we'd talk. Not always. Sometimes not at all. But when we did talk, it had a quality that I hadn't experienced since I was maybe 17. In those late-night conversations you have with someone when the normal rules of how you're supposed to present yourself have gone soft around the edges. He told me about growing up in eastern Wyoming, about his father, who he mentioned once and then did not mention again, in a way that made the silence around the subject very clear. About a horse he'd had as a kid, a strawberry roan named Echo, who had been sold when he was 12 and who he had never fully gotten over losing. I told him about Phoenix, about my mother, who worked double shifts at a hospital and who I hadn't seen in 4 months, about how I'd ended up at the equine therapy center by accident. I'd walked past it one afternoon and heard a horse and just stopped, the way you stop when something calls to something in you that you didn't know was there. What does that feel like? He asked one morning in the 4th week. We were checking Sable together, standing on opposite sides of her stall, the young filly between us like a warm and breathing secret. What does what feel like? Hearing something and just knowing. He said it quietly, not like a philosophical question, like a real one, like he was asking about something he'd been thinking about for a while. I looked at him over Sable's back. The early light was coming through the stable's high windows, and it fell across his face in a way that made the amber of his eyes look almost gold. Like recognition, I said, like something you forgot you knew. He looked at me for a long, still moment. Then he looked back down at Sable and ran his hand along her neck, and I watched his fingers move, and I thought about something I hadn't let myself think about clearly yet. I let it go, back into the part of my mind where things wait when you're not ready for them. But it was there now, it had a shape. By the end of the first month, something had shifted in the bunkhouse that I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't announced. It was simply that the 8 men I lived and worked with had quietly, collectively, decided something about me. I don't know exactly when it happened or what tipped the balance, but somewhere between the Rio situation and the night I helped Hector fix the water heater at midnight with nothing but a headlamp and a box of tools neither of us was fully sure how to use, I stopped being the new hand and started being simply part of it. This manifested in small ways. Bobby started telling me things in the morning before the day's work began, not instructions, but context, the kind of background information that only gets shared when someone has decided you're going to be around long enough to need it. Marcus challenged me to a card game and didn't go easy on me, which was its own kind of respect. Even Gil, who had spent weeks waiting for me to make a mistake big enough to confirm his initial skepticism, started casually asking my opinion on things, slipping it into conversation so naturally that I don't think he was fully aware he was doing it. The one relationship I couldn't map cleanly was Cade. Because Cade and I want to be precise here, because imprecision would be dishonest, we were close, in a way that was real and complicated and that neither of us had ever directly named. We worked together every day. We talked, in those early mornings, with an openness that felt genuinely rare. We'd fallen into the habit of sitting on the top fence rail of the east pasture in the evening after the day's work was done, watching the horses in the last light, not always talking, and those silences were comfortable in the way that silences only are with someone you trust completely. But there was also something else, something underneath all of it that I felt like a change in air pressure, subtle, pervasive, impossible to ignore if you knew what weather felt like before it arrived. It was in the way he sometimes went quiet mid-sentence when I looked at him directly, the way he would be working 6 feet away and then somehow be 3 feet away, and neither of us would have consciously closed the distance. The way, one afternoon, he'd handed me a tool and our fingers had touched for one ordinary second, and he'd gone very still in a way that was not ordinary at all. I was 22 years old and I understood what I was feeling. I had understood it about myself, with varying degrees of peace, since I was about 15. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know without a clarity that neither of us was offering the other, was what Cade felt, or what he knew about himself, or whether any of this existed on his side of the fence rail at all. So I held it, the way you hold something fragile and valuable, carefully, with both hands, not sure yet whether to set it down. There was an afternoon in the 6th week when the thing I was holding got harder to hold. It was a Sunday. The crew had the afternoon mostly free. Most of the hands had driven into Sutter Creek for various errands or socializing. Hugh was in his office. The ranch had gone quiet in that particular Sunday way, the kind of quiet that feels slightly larger than the building it's in. I was in the equipment room, repairing a bridle that had come apart at one of the stitched connections, meticulous work, the kind I liked, that required attention and patience and didn't leave room in your head for other things. I was so absorbed in it that I didn't hear Cade come in. I registered him by presence before I registered him by sound or sight, that same quality I'd noticed on the first morning, the way his stillness has a weight to it. I looked up, and he was leaning in the doorway, watching me work with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. "You've been in here 2 hours," he said. "Has it been that long?" "Almost." I put down the bridle and stretched my hands, which had started to cramp. "I wanted to get this done before Tuesday. Captain's going to need." "I know," he said. "I'm not criticizing." A pause. He came into the room and sat on the workbench across from me, not picking up anything, not working, just sitting. This was unusual. Cade was not someone who sat still without purpose. "What?" I said. "Nothing." "Cade." He looked at me, then he said, "Do you like it here?" The question was quiet, careful, in the tone of something that had been sitting behind other questions for a while. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "Really, not just tolerating it." "Really," I watched him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a horse called out and another answered, the sound of the ranch at rest. "People come through," he said. "Temporary hires. They come for a season and then they leave. It's just how it works." He said this matter-of-factly, without complaint. "I just wanted to know if you were going to." I looked at him steadily. He was not looking at me. He was looking at a point somewhere near the workbench, the way he did sometimes when he was saying something that required him to look away from the person he was saying it to. "I'm not planning on it," I said. The silence that followed was different from our normal silences. It had a warmth to it. He exhaled slowly, and the slight tension across his shoulders released in a way that I wasn't supposed to notice, but did notice, because I always noticed the way he held his body. Good, he said, just that. He picked up a piece of tack from the workbench and started working on it, head down, and we worked together in the Sunday quiet for another hour, not talking much, and the whole time I was aware of that word still in the air between us. Good. The way he'd said it, like relief. The incident with Rio happened on a Thursday. It wasn't dangerous, not really. Rio was aggressive with people he didn't know and unpredictable under stress, but since I'd been working with him steadily, he had become, if not docile, at least manageable. The problem was that Marcus, who was impatient with horses, had attempted to move Rio to the east pasture without waiting for me that morning because I was running behind schedule. Rio had objected, loudly, physically, in the way that a bored and intelligent horse objects when handled by someone whose energy is too quick and whose body language says hurry up. He'd backed Marcus into a corner of the stall, not violently, but decisively, ears flat, body angled, making his feelings very clear. I got there 2 minutes later. I came through the stable door and took in the scene, Marcus flat against the wall, Rio still blocking the exit, both of them in the elevated state of mutual alarm, and I went straight in. I didn't rush, that was the key. I came in unhurried, speaking before I was close enough for Rio to hear words, just the rhythm of the voice, steady and low. I moved to Rio's side and put my hand on his neck and kept talking, the specific kind of nothing talk that you learn after enough time with horses. Not meaningful, just present, just a voice saying here, here, it's fine, nobody's going anywhere. And within 30 seconds Rio's ears came up and his breathing slowed, and the stall went from confrontation to just 3 creatures standing close together in a small space. Marcus got out. He was shaken but unhurt. He stood outside the stall and stared at me. That's actually, he started. Don't go in alone with him, I said, not harshly. Not yet. Give him another 2 weeks. Marcus nodded. He ran a hand over his face and let out a long breath. Yeah, okay, yeah. I should note that none of what I just described was witnessed by the crew at large, because it happened at 7 in the morning. What was witnessed by several of them was the aftermath, specifically the 10 minutes after, when I was still in the stall with Rio, keeping him company while his system settled, and Cade appeared at the stall door. He stood there for a moment, looking at me and Rio together. Marcus told me, he said. It was fine, I said. He was just stressed. Rio or Marcus? Both. A small pause. Something moved across Cade's face, quick and complicated, there and gone. You need to be more careful, he said. I looked up at him. His jaw was set and his voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that was not controlled, a tightness that I recognized as the residue of fear. I was careful, I said gently. I know, he said. I know you were. He pressed his hand flat against the stall door, then let go. He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't. He turned and walked away. I watched him go and then turned back to Rio, who had dropped his head and was breathing slowly, completely calm now, the whole event already receding for him the way events do for horses, clean, no residue. I stood there thinking about Cade's face at the stall door. The tightness, the controlled voice, the that stopped before it arrived anywhere. I held that too, carefully. The second big storm of the season came down from the mountains on a Friday night in late October, and it was meaner than the first. We knew it was coming. Hugh had checked the weather and repositioned 3 horses to the more sheltered inner stable during the afternoon. Cade and I had reinforced the east stable's windward wall, which had a questionable board that both of us had noted independently. By the time dinner was done and the sky had gone the specific dark green that means serious weather, everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The power went out around 9. The bunkhouse filled with the flat, yellowish light of hurricane lanterns, and the crew settled into the kind of forced proximity that bad weather creates, card games, Hector distributing coffee with an authority that suggested he had personally negotiated with the storm, Bobby reading in the corner by a lantern. The wind picked up until you could hear it between the walls of the bunkhouse, low and constant, and somehow personal. I was sitting on my bunk, not reading, not playing cards, thinking about the horses. Specifically about Sable, who was still newly enough to the ranch that storms felt genuinely threatening to her, and about Captain, who I knew was still carrying the edginess from the last storm and whose stall was in the outer stable, furthest from shelter. I got up and started pulling on my rain gear. "Where are you going?" Marcus asked. "Just to check on a couple of them." A few looks exchanged around the room. Bobby turned a page. "Take a radio," he said. "Take a lantern that actually works," Hector added, which was targeted at the lantern I'd grabbed, which was slightly dimmer than it should have been. I was at the door when I became aware of movement behind me. I turned. Cade was putting his jacket on. "You don't have to come," I said. "I know," he said, which was, by now, a familiar kind of answer between us. We went out together into the storm. It was a real storm, wind-driven rain that hit horizontally and found every gap in your clothing. The ground between the bunkhouse and the outer stable had turned to mud that sucked at your boots with every step. Cade had a proper storm lantern, much better than mine, and we moved close together through the dark, heads down against the rain. The outer stable was loud with the weather, the roof shaking, the horses moving in their stalls with that nervous, high-energy packing that means they can hear something big and haven't decided yet whether to be afraid of it. We came in through the side door, out of the worst of the wind, and the relative shelter of the stable walls made the quiet inside feel almost enormous. We moved through the stalls quickly and efficiently, checking latches, checking water, speaking to each horse in turn, that same low, steady sound that settles them. Captain was as I'd expected, elevated, ears forward, reading everything. I spent more time with him, one hand on his neck, one on his flank, letting him feel the steadiness that I was mostly manufacturing, because honestly the storm was unsettling for me too, and there's something strange about performing calm for a creature who can feel what's underneath it. Cade was 2 stalls down, doing the same work, and through the noise of the storm I could hear his voice, low, continuous, unhurried. It had the same quality in the storm that it had in the quiet mornings, consistent, real. We met at Sable's stall. She was the worst of them, standing at the back of the stall, eyes wide, body trembling slightly with every thunder crack that rolled in from the mountains. Cade went in without discussion, and I followed, and we stood on either side of her the way we sometimes did in the mornings, the filly between us, and we worked her down. It took a while, longer than usual, because the storm wasn't letting up and she could feel that too. But Cade was patient in a way that I don't have a good word for. It wasn't passive patience, the kind that just waits. It was active, intentional, like he was genuinely present with her, not somewhere else with half his attention, but fully there. I watched him, in the lantern light, doing this. There was lightning. It lit up the high windows of the stable in blue-white bursts, and in one of those bursts I saw his face clearly, the concentration, the care, the way his lips were moving in that continuous low murmur, and something in my chest did something I couldn't organize into a thought quickly enough. And then Sable shifted suddenly, startled by a particularly close crack of thunder, and stepped sideways hard, and in the narrow stall the two of us were suddenly very close, his shoulder against mine, his arm brushing my arm as we both instinctively moved to steady her. We both went still. The storm outside was enormous, and the lantern was small, and Sable had quieted again, and neither of us moved. I was aware of the warmth of his shoulder through the wet canvas of his jacket. I was aware of his breathing, slightly uneven, the way breathing gets when something has been startled. I was aware of how close his face was to mine in the dim lantern light, close enough that if either of us had turned the other way, it would have meant something. Neither of us turned. What we did instead was nothing, not nothing empty, not nothing meaningless, nothing careful, nothing that was making a choice by not making a choice. He moved first, just a half step, enough to restore the ordinary geometry of 2 people standing in a horse stall. His arm was no longer touching mine. "She's calming down," he said. His voice was its usual even, unhurried self, but he wasn't looking at me. "Yeah," I said, my voice, I noticed, was not entirely even. We stayed with her until the worst of the storm passed. We walked back to the bunkhouse through the diminishing rain, close together, not speaking. The bunkhouse was quiet. Most of the crew had gone to sleep. We came in and stripped off our wet gear in the dark of the entryway, and that moment of shared dark was brief and ordinary and not ordinary. We went to our respective bunks. I lay in the dark, listening to the rain slow, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the half-step he'd taken. Careful, that's what it had been, not retreat, careful. There's a difference. 3 days after the storm, a truck I didn't recognize pulled into the Double H. I was in the west paddock, working sable on a long lunge line, slow circles, slow build, the kind of work that requires divided attention, one part of you with the horse, and one part watching the perimeter for anything that might spook her. I saw the truck from across the field, newer than most of the vehicles on the property, dark blue, clean, and filed it away as background information. It wasn't until lunchtime that I met the person who'd been in it. His name was Jordan Whitfield. He was 26, from Billings, with easy good looks and the assured manner of someone who has always known he comes across well. He turned out to be an old friend of Cade's. They'd grown up in the same part of Wyoming, had gone to the same high school, and judging by the way the bunkhouse received him, he'd been here before. Multiple times. He moved through the space with the comfort of someone who knew where the coffee was kept. He and Cade shook hands, that hard grip, pull-together, backslap thing that male friendship sometimes looks like, and then they stood there talking in a shorthand full of references I didn't have, names I didn't know, shared history that predated my existence at the Double H by years. I told myself this was completely normal, an old friend coming to visit, completely standard. I ate my lunch and talked to Terrence about fence repair schedules and paid approximately zero unusual attention to Jordan Whitfield. This was not entirely true. What I was actually doing, with that part of my attention I pretended was elsewhere, was watching Cade. Watching the way he was different with Jordan, looser, louder, quicker to laugh than I had ever seen him. Watching the way Jordan put his hand on Cade's shoulder when he laughed at something, casual, habitual, familiar, in the way that long history makes things familiar. I noticed that I did not like this, and then I noticed that I noticed, and then I quietly put that observation in a locked room and threw away the key. Jordan was staying for the weekend. This was, apparently, something that happened when he came through. He'd stay in the bunkhouse, help with whatever work needed doing, then move on. Hugh seemed to like him. The crew liked him. He was genuinely likable, which I noted as if it were a character flaw. That evening, the crew gathered at the card table, the usual Friday night cards that I'd become part of, that Cade was usually part of. But tonight, the geometry was different. Jordan was there, and the easy way he occupied the space shifted the configuration of the group, and Cade, who normally ended up next to me by the unspoken gravity of two people who work closely together, ended up across the table, next to Jordan, and they were deep in a conversation about people and places I knew nothing about. I played cards. I was fine. I lost 40 cents to Bobby, who had a statistically impossible ability to win at poker without ever appearing to be paying attention. I talked to Marcus about something. I drank Hector's coffee. I did not look at Cade and Jordan more than was natural. After the game broke up, I went outside. I don't know exactly why. I just needed the air. I stood on the bunkhouse steps, looking out at the dark of the property, the outlines of the stables against the sky, the soft glow from the farmhouse windows, the enormous quiet of the Montana night. I heard the door open behind me. "Hey," Cade's voice. I turned. He was standing in the doorway with his jacket halfway on, the light from inside framing him. "Hey," I said. He came out and stood beside me. For a moment, we were just in the night air, side by side, looking out at the same dark. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah." He didn't respond immediately. The silence between us had a different texture tonight, slightly careful in a way our usual silences weren't. "Jordan's a lot," he said. It wasn't an apology, just an offering. "He seems great," I said, and I meant it in a way that was also not entirely accurate. Cade was quiet. I could feel him looking at me sideways. "He's a good friend," Cade said. "Old friend, it's different." I didn't know what to do with that distinction. I looked up at the sky. The stars had come out after the storm, thick and overwhelming the way they got out here, nothing between you and them. "I know that," I said. Another silence. Then you disappeared after cards. "I just needed some air." "Eli," he said my name in a way that was quiet and direct, the way his voice was in the stables, the way it got when he was saying something real. "You don't have to." "Don't have to what?" He turned to face me. I turned to face him. We were close, not quite as close as we'd been in the storm, but close enough that I could see his expression clearly in the dark, and his expression was the most open I had ever seen it. The reserve was still there, because reserve was just part of how he was built, but underneath, it was something that wasn't reserve at all. Something that was, if I was reading it right, and I had been reading him for almost 2 months, I was fairly good at it by now, something that was very specifically about me. "Don't overthink tonight," he said. "That's what you're doing." I looked at him. My heart was doing something that I was trying, with limited success, to keep from showing on my face. "How do you know what I'm doing?" "Because I know you," he said simply. 3 words, and yet. The door opened again. Jordan's head appeared. "Cade, man, I've got a hand that is going to make you cry. You have to come see this." Cade looked at me for 1 more second. Then he turned and went back inside. He held the door open and looked at me with a question in his expression. I went back in. I sat down at the card table, and I thought, for the rest of the night, about "because I know you," the particular weight of it, the particular way he'd said it, like it was a fact he had been sitting with for a while. Jordan left on Sunday. The bunkhouse went back to its normal configuration, and yet something was different. I don't know if it was Jordan's visit that caused it, or the moment on the bunkhouse steps, or the night of the storm, or some accumulation of all of it that had reached a particular threshold. But in the week that followed, I noticed that Cade had put not distance exactly, but space. A careful, deliberate space that wasn't there before. He was still in the stables in the mornings. We still worked together. But those conversations that had gone deep in the early light, the ones about Wyoming and Phoenix and horses named Echo, had retreated to the surface. He was present, but shallower, not cold, not unfriendly, just back behind something. I sat with this for a few days before it started to hurt. Then it started to hurt. The particular pain of being kept at a distance by someone whose closeness you have become used to is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. It's not dramatic. It's not the sharp pain of an argument or a betrayal. It's a quiet, cumulative pain, the slight shift of his shoulder when I moved near him, the conversation that ended just before it would have gone somewhere real, the absence of eye contact that used to be the most natural thing between us. I threw myself into work. This is my standard strategy for avoiding my own interior, and it works reasonably well in the short term. I worked Sable every day until she was taking obstacles she'd refused before. I went through every piece of tack in the equipment room and repaired or replaced everything that needed it. I asked Bobby to teach me some of the cattlework skills I was weakest on, and spent 3 consecutive afternoons following him around the north pasture learning things that had nothing to do with horses. Bobby noticed, in that quiet Bobby way of noticing things. He didn't say anything for 2 days, and then on the 3rd afternoon he said, without preamble, while fixing a section of fence, "Whatever's going on, give it time. Things work themselves out here. The land doesn't let people run from things for very long." I looked at him. He was looking at the fence with great concentration. "What makes you think something is going on?" I said. He gave me a look that was patient in the way that only genuinely patient people can manage, not condescending, just having waited longer than I had. "I've been on this ranch 12 years, he said. "I know what people look like when they're working too hard to not think about something." I didn't say anything. He went back to the fence. "Give it time," he said again. The thing that broke the pattern was unexpected and came from outside, which is often how these things work. There was a competition, not a rodeo exactly, but a regional horsemanship exhibition held at a facility 30 miles north in the first week of November. Hugh had entered 3 horses, Captain, Maple, and at my suggestion, Sable. It was the kind of competition that wasn't about winning, it was about demonstrating the quality of the animal and the work that had gone into their handling. Hugh had agreed somewhat skeptically, noting that Sable was still green. I'd said that she was ready, and I'd believed it. I was handling Sable in the exhibition. Cade was handling Captain. Terence was handling Maple. The drive up to the exhibition facility was 45 minutes on a straight Montana road with the mountains on one side and open range on the other, and by some arrangement of truck capacity that I hadn't engineered but also hadn't tried to change, I ended up in the passenger seat of Cade's truck, the 2 of us alone for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The first 10 minutes were quiet, the easy kind, and then not quite the easy kind. "She's ready," I said finally, meaning Sable. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you work with her." I looked at him. "You have?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the road. "Yeah." Another mile of silence. The mountains were extraordinary in the November morning, the peaks already snow-capped, the sky a cold, clean blue. "Cade," I said. "Don't," he said, quiet, not harsh. I'm not going to push anything." I said it carefully, meaning it. "I just want to know that we're okay." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "We're okay." "Because it doesn't feel." "Eli," he said my name in that particular way again. "We're okay. I just needed some time to think." "About what?" A long pause. "Things." Which told me nothing and everything. "Okay," I said, and then, because I didn't want the next 30 minutes to be painful, "Tell me about the competition format. I want to know what the judges are looking for." He exhaled, something released in the cab of the truck. He started talking about the exhibition, the gating patterns, the obstacle courses, the judge criteria, and gradually the thing between us found its way back to the surface. We both knew how to navigate. And by the time we pulled into the exhibition facility parking lot, we were talking almost normally, almost like before. Almost. Sable won her category. Not the whole competition. There were horses there who had been shown for years, with handlers who had decades of experience. But in her category, the young mare's class, she performed everything I had been teaching her with a composure and steadiness that made Hugh's skepticism disappear in real time. I watched him watching her from the rail, his expression moving through surprise to something warmer. I was watching her from the ring, of course, and whatever else was going on in my head, in those minutes I was entirely present with her, with every shift of her weight, every ear position, every subtle communication between her body and mine. She trusted me. She had decided to trust me about 2 weeks in, and she had never stopped, and there's something genuinely moving about being trusted by an animal in that unconditional way. After the young mare's category, I brought Sable out to the rail where Hugh and a few of the crew were standing, and she stood calmly while people came to look at her, which 3 months ago would have been impossible. Cade was there. He had finished with Captain, who had performed impeccably, as he always did, with the easy confidence of a horse who had been very well handled for a very long time. He was standing just outside the group, hat back on, arms crossed in that way he had when he was observing something he wasn't ready to comment on yet. When the brief crowd around Sable dispersed, he came forward. He stood in front of her and held out his hand, and she dipped her nose into his palm with a familiarity that was. He looked up at me over her nose. His expression was open, the most open I'd seen it since before the pulling back had started. Something in the morning and the light and the small victory of the exhibition had loosened whatever he'd been holding. "Good work," he said. 2 words, the particular way he said them. I felt my face do something I didn't try to control. I just let myself have the moment. "Thank you." He held Sable's gaze for another second, then looked back at me, and the look lasted long enough that it was a different kind of look than the ones we usually exchanged. Something inside of it, some layer under the ordinary surface. Then Bobby clapped me on the shoulder and said something about Hector bringing sandwiches from the cooler, and the moment dispersed into the ordinary afternoon. But it had been there. I wasn't imagining it. The thing that caused the fracture was small. The things that cause fractures usually are. It was a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the exhibition. The workday was done. Most of the crew was in the bunkhouse or the common area. I was in the stables doing a last check. I always did a last check. It had become routine, and Cade had come in to do the same, for the same reason, because some routines you fall into together without discussing it. We were at opposite ends of the main stable. The lights were low, the overhead strips were off, just the softer utility lights near each stall. It was quiet. The horses were settled for the evening. I was checking Duchess, the old bay mare, running a hand along her legs to check for any heat that might suggest soreness. I looked up and found Cade watching me from across the stable. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, in the posture he had when he was waiting for something or thinking about something, and he was watching me with an expression that I had stopped trying to translate from a distance because I was always wrong about it, and then I'd spend 2 hours second-guessing myself. But we looked at each other across the stable, and something in that look was held, both of us holding it, not looking away. Then Marcus came in. He came in from the side door, loudly. The way Marcus did everything, already talking. Eli, Hector wants to know if you're coming for dinner because he made that thing you liked with the... He stopped. He stood in the doorway, looking at me, then at Cade, then back at me, with the quick social radar of a 20-year-old who has grown up paying attention to people. He read the room. I could see him reading it. Am I, he started, should I? What did Hector make, I said, even normal. The chicken thing, with the peppers. Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. Marcus looked at Cade briefly, a look that was quick and careful, and then back at me. Sure, he said. Yeah, he went back out the door. I turned back to Duchess. My face was warm. I focused on her leg and kept my breathing even. From across the stable, Eli. I looked up. Cade was still in the same position, but something in his face had changed. The openness was gone. The reserve was back, fully, like a door that had been slightly ajar and had just swung shut. I'm going to finish up in here, he said. Go eat. His voice was even, normal, the voice of someone who was absolutely fine and needed me to also be absolutely fine. I recognized it because I used the same voice sometimes. Okay, I said. I put Duchess's leg down. I walked out of the stable. I went and ate Hector's chicken with peppers, which was excellent, and I talked to Terence about something, and I was completely fine. That night, lying in my bunk, I stared at the ceiling and thought, I can't keep doing this. Not meaning I was going to do anything about it, just noting it, the way you note a storm on the horizon before it arrives. It was there, it was coming, it would come on its own schedule. What followed was the hardest period I had at the Double H. Cade and I didn't argue. We didn't create a scene. We continued to work together every day, continued to be, outwardly, exactly what we'd been, two people who worked well together and respected each other. The mornings in the stable were still there. The fence rail in the evenings was still there. The conversations were still there. But the depth was gone. It was like a river that has pulled back from its banks. The bed is still there. The shape of where the water was is still visible, but the water itself has retreated to the center and you can see the gap. I did what I always did when I was unhappy. I worked. I pushed Sable into more advanced training. I took on additional stable repairs that weren't strictly my responsibility. I had a long conversation with Bobby one afternoon that started about cattle grazing and ended, somehow, about whether people are ever really honest with themselves about what they want. And Bobby had said, without looking at me, the honest answer is almost never until they don't have any other choice. The crew noticed, or at least some of them did. Terence didn't, because Terence's emotional intelligence was wide but not particularly deep. Hector noticed, and showed it in the way he showed care for everything by feeding me. Marcus noticed, and showed it by being conspicuously normal around me in a way that meant he was trying very hard not to indicate that he'd noticed anything. Danny noticed, I think, but Danny processed the world at such a slow and considered pace that by the time he would have said anything, circumstances had probably already resolved. And Gil, who had started as my skeptic and ended as something like a rough-edged ally, came and found me one afternoon while I was repairing the east fence and said, "You look like someone who needs to say something and keeps deciding not to." I looked at him. He was very direct when he decided to be. "I'm fine," I said. "Sure," he said. He picked up a fence tool and started working alongside me. "You know what this ranch doesn't have room for?" "What?" "Regret," he said. He said it like it was a technical term. "I've seen it before. A man's been here 11 years, and he spent the last 3 of them regretting something he didn't say to someone who left. Don't do that." He didn't specify who or what he was referring to. He didn't need to. We fixed the fence in silence. When we were done, he picked up his tools and walked back toward the barn without further comment. I stood there for a minute, looking out over the east pasture where Sable was grazing in the late afternoon light, calm and beautiful and no longer afraid of the things that used to terrify her. "Don't do that," Gil had said. "Okay." The night everything came to a head was in late November, and it started with something so mundane that looking back on it, I almost find it funny. It started with a truck that wouldn't start. The property's oldest utility truck, the one that was essentially held together by stubbornness and Hector's mechanical prayers, had died completely in the equipment lot, and Danny, who was supposed to drive into Sutter Creek for a supply run before the hardware store closed, could not get it going. I offered my truck. Simple, unremarkable. Danny took my truck, which meant I didn't have a vehicle, which meant when Hugh, at around 6 in the evening, asked if someone could drive to the east boundary to check a section of fence that had been reported wobbly by one of the grazing crew, my normal option wasn't available. Cade had his truck. "I'll come with you," I said. It came out before I'd fully decided to say it. We were all in the farmhouse living room when Hugh brought it up, and Cade had stood up and said he'd go, and then I had said those words. Cade looked at me, a look that lasted just a second longer than a casual look. "Okay," he said. We drove out to the east boundary in the grey November dusk. The fence section was where it had been reported, 3 posts that had worked loose in the recent rain, the wire sagging and vulnerable. We worked on it with the quiet efficiency that came from weeks of working side by side, each of us knowing what the other needed before it had to be said. The last light disappeared while we worked. We finished by the headlights of the truck. When we were done, we stood by the truck for a moment. The night was very cold and very clear, the kind of November night in Montana that feels like the air has been scraped clean. The stars were out in force, brutal and beautiful. Cade put the tools in the truck bed. He came around to the driver's side but didn't get in. He stood there, hand on the door, looking out at the field. "Can I ask you something?" I said. A pause. "Yeah." "What are you afraid of?" The silence after that question was long. I watched him. His face was still, the way it got when he was processing something that required real thought. "What makes you think I'm afraid?" he said. "Because I know you," I said. He turned and looked at me then, and the look was unguarded in a way that his looks rarely were. The kind of unguarded that happens when you use someone's own words back at them and they can't pretend they don't know what you mean. "Eli." "You don't have to say anything," I said. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just need to say it out loud once, and then I won't bring it up again if you don't want me to." I took a breath of cold air. "I don't know what you feel. I know what I feel. And I know that you've been pulling back for a month, and I don't know if that's because something is there and it scares you, or because nothing is there and you picked up on something from me and you don't know how to handle it without hurting me, and either answer is okay. I can work with either answer. What I can't keep working with is not knowing, because the not knowing it's taking up space I don't have to spare." I stopped. The night was enormous and cold around us. Cade hadn't moved. He was looking at me, and his expression was, I had never seen this expression on him, not the reserve, not the quiet, not the careful distance. This was something underneath all of that, something that had been underneath it this whole time, and it was looking at me directly for the first time. I don't know how to, he stopped. He pushed off from the truck and turned away, taking 3 steps into the field, and I thought for a moment that he was going to walk away from this entirely, the way he'd walked out of things before. But he stopped. He stood there with his back to me, and I could see by the set of his shoulders that whatever was happening inside him was real and large and not easy. I've never, he started, stopped again. I waited. The land taught me patience. He'd taught me patience. There have been things I've felt. He said it with difficulty, each word coming separately, like they each required their own decision. Things I've pushed away my whole life because it wasn't something I knew how to. I grew up in a place where you don't. He stopped, exhaled. I don't have a language for it yet. That's the honest answer. I don't have a language for it yet. I let that sit for a moment in the cold air. Okay, I said. My voice was careful and gentle. That's okay. He turned around. He was looking at me from 5 feet away, and his expression was raw in the way that something is raw when the thing protecting it has been removed. Vulnerable, but not small. There was nothing small about Cade Harlow. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. It was an honest statement, not a confession of failure. Neither do I said. I don't think that's the important part. What's the important part? I looked at him. The stars were overhead, and the Montana night was enormous, and the truck headlights were still on, making us small in the middle of a big field, and I said, the important part is whether what you feel is real, not what you're supposed to feel or what you know how to call it yet. Just, is it real? He looked at me for a very long time. Yes, he said, quiet, the way he said most things that mattered. It's real. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. It had a warmth in it that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. I took a step toward him. He didn't step back. We stood there in the November field, close, not touching, not yet, not in any hurry, because we had gotten here slowly and there was no reason to be in a hurry now. We stood there and looked at each other with all of it visible, everything I'd held carefully for months and everything he'd been afraid to let surface, and neither of us looked away. Okay, I said softly, okay. That was all. That was everything. I will not pretend that everything became simple. What happened in that November field was real, and it was important, and it was a beginning, not an ending, not a resolution of every complicated thing. A beginning, which is what beginnings are, full of possibility and also full of the weight of what the next step looks like. We drove back to the ranch that night with something different between us, not heavy, not anxious, just present, like the air in a room after a window has been opened. We didn't tell the crew anything. It wasn't a secret exactly. It wasn't a calculated concealment. It was just that we needed a little time to exist in this new territory before handing it over to anyone else's perception. There is a tenderness in new things that needs privacy to survive its first days. The next morning, I was in the stable before dawn as always. I was with Captain, running through the morning check with the steady routine of it, when I heard the side door open. I looked up. Cade came down the aisle in the half-dark, hat in his hand, and he stopped in front of Captain's stall and looked at me, and his face was different, not performing the reserve, not using the stillness as a wall, just present and a little uncertain in the way that the morning after real honesty always is, and looking at me like he was checking to see if daylight had changed anything. It didn't change anything, I said, before he could say whatever he'd come to say. He studied me for a moment, then something in his face settled and he put his hat back on, and he came to stand beside me at Captain's stall the way he always did. Good, he said. And we went to work. Here's the thing about living in close quarters with 7 other people. They know before you tell them, because they share your daily life in a proximity that most people don't share with anyone outside their immediate family. They notice the small things, the shift in your posture, the morning mood, the particular way you move around someone when the relationship between you has changed. Hector was the first to say something. He did it in the way Hector did everything that required emotional courage, by feeding it. The morning after, I came into the farmhouse kitchen for breakfast, and there was an extra portion on the counter with my name on a sticky note, and next to it, a second sticky note that said don't overthink anything. That was all. Hector was at the stove with his back to me and didn't turn around. I stood there for a moment, reading the sticky notes, and then I laughed, quietly to myself, the kind of laugh that comes from being known. Terence was next in his way, which was considerably less subtle. He came and found me in the west paddock that afternoon and said loudly, "I knew it." And then, before I could respond to that, "I win the thing." He walked off, refusing to explain what the thing was, but looking extremely satisfied. I thought about this later. I thought about the fact that apparently a bet or something like it had been going on, and the warm exasperation I felt about it was not really exasperation at all. Bobby said nothing, which was exactly what Bobby saying a great deal looked like. Marcus, who had been the most visibly aware that something had been going on, became conspicuously cheerful in a way that was endearing and also deeply obvious. Danny nodded at me one morning, just nodded. For Danny, that was practically a speech. I'll give Gil this, came and said directly, with zero preamble, looking at a point past my left shoulder. Good. It was making everyone uncomfortable watching you two walk around it. Then he walked away. Which left Owen. Owen, who was the youngest of the original 8 before I arrived, who observed everything with that perpetual amusement, who had never said a direct word about any of it. Owen found me that Sunday evening sitting on the east fence rail at dusk, which had become Cade's and my evening habit. I was alone at the moment. Cade had gone back to the stable for something. Owen came and sat on the fence beside me, and we looked at the horses in the field together. "Can I tell you something?" Owen said. "Sure." "Cade's been on this ranch for 7 years," Owen said. "In 7 years, I never saw him talk to anyone the way he talks to you. Not Jordan, not any of us." He paused. "I don't know what that means to you, but it means something." I looked at him. He was watching the horses. "It means something to me," I said. He nodded once, jumped down from the fence. "Good," he said, and walked back toward the bunkhouse, and that was that. Over the weeks that followed, I watched Cade find the language he'd said he didn't have. It didn't come all at once. It came the way things come when they've been long suppressed and are now carefully, tentatively allowed, in pieces, in quiet moments, in the space that the early mornings had always been and were now a little more. One morning he told me about a summer when he was 17, working on a ranch in Wyoming, and there had been another hand there, older, and he'd felt something he hadn't known the name for, and he'd buried it so deep and so fast that it had felt, afterward, like it had never happened. He said this looking at Captain's stall, not at me, in the careful way he talked about things that cost him something to say. "And now?" I asked. He looked at me. "Now I'm standing here telling you about it," he said, "which feels like something." It did feel like something. It felt like courage, the specific kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly does the thing while looking the other way. One evening on the fence rail, the horses moving slowly in the last light, he said, "I don't know how my uncle is going to." "He's going to be fine," I said. "He's the one who specifically told me you were particular and to be patient with you." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he did. "First morning." Another pause. What did he mean by particular? "I think he meant exactly what you are." He turned that over for a while. Then, quietly, how are you easy about all of it?" "I'm not," I said. "I've been terrified for months. I'm just better at performing easy than you are at performing not terrified." He looked at me with something between surprise and real amusement, and I'd never seen him look amused like that, like something genuinely funny had caught him off guard, and his whole face changed when he laughed, properly, which he didn't do often. It was the best thing I'd seen in weeks. I'd been at the Double H for almost 4 months when Cade talked to Hugh. I wasn't there for the conversation. That was right, it was between them, and I didn't ask for a debrief afterward. What I knew was that Cade had gone to the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon and been in there for a long time, and when he came out, he had the specific expression of someone who has said something hard and found that the world did not end. Hugh found me the next morning. He came to the stable while I was doing the first check, earlier than he usually came, and he leaned on the stall gate the way Cade did, and he looked at me with those steady foreman eyes. "You're good for him," he said, not asking, nodding. "He's good for me," I said. He looked at me for another moment, then he nodded once, the same conclusive nod he'd given on the first morning when he'd decided something. "Okay," he said. He pushed off the gate. "Don't let it affect the work." "I wouldn't." "I know you wouldn't, that's why I said okay." He started walking back down the aisle, then stopped. "And Eli," he looked back, "I'm glad you stayed." He walked out into the morning, and I stood there with Duchess's face next to my shoulder, her warm animal breath against my neck, and I thought about 11 hours of driving with my savings in an envelope and a name on a piece of paper and nothing at all certain except that I needed something to change. Something had changed. The first real snow came in early December, and the Double H changed under it, softened and sharpened at once, the way landscapes do with snow. The ranch was beautiful in a way it hadn't been when I arrived, in ways I couldn't have imagined that first September morning because I didn't have the eyes for it yet. I had the eyes for it now. I was working Sable in the indoor arena on a cold Tuesday morning, going through a routine that had become genuinely a joy, because Sable had become a genuinely joyful horse to work with. 3 months ago, she was shaking in the back of her stall in a storm. Now she took obstacles with an easy confidence that Hugh had stopped trying to hide his pleasure in, and whenever I brought her into the arena, she came to the gate with her nose up and her ears forward, looking for work, which was the greatest compliment a horse could give. I was in the middle of a lateral movement sequence when I became aware of someone on the observation rail above the arena. I looked up. Cade was leaning on the rail, watching. He'd been there for a while, I thought. He had the settled posture of someone who'd been watching long enough to be comfortable. I brought Sable around to the end of the arena and stopped below the rail. She looked up at Cade with immediate recognition, and he reached down and touched her nose with 2 fingers. "She's ready for real work," he said. "Next spring," I said. "Hugh and I talked about starting her on light cattle work in April." He nodded, looking at her with that expression he had for things he'd had a hand in, not proud exactly, but claiming something. "I remember the first night she was here," he said. "She was so afraid." "You sat with her for 3 hours," I said. He looked at me. "How do you know that?" "Hector told me, first week." He was quiet for a moment. Then, looking back at Sable, she was going to fall apart if someone didn't just be there. "That's why she trusts you," I said. "You were there when she needed it." He looked at me, I looked at him. The observation rail was between us, and we were both holding this horse between us, and the snow was coming down outside, and the arena was warm and quiet. "Come down here," I said. He came down from the observation platform and through the gate, and stood with me in the middle of the arena, and Sable stood between us exactly as she had in that first storm, calm, warm, trusting, and Cade's shoulder was against mine, and neither of us moved away. "Good morning," he said, quietly, just to me. "Good morning," I said. The December snow came down outside, and Sable exhaled slowly, and everything was, in that moment, very much as it should be. This is the moment I started with, the moment from the opening, the bunkhouse, the silence, the 8 cowboys, the 2 words. Let me tell you how we got there. It was mid-December, 4 months since I'd arrived. The Christmas preparations were beginning at the Double H. Hugh's wife, Linda, who spent most of the fall at her sister's in Billings and came back in December, was imposing a holiday transformation on the farmhouse with the serene authority of someone who has done this for 20 years and knows that the crew will ultimately help because she feeds them well. Terence had put up a strand of lights along the bunkhouse roof that were only about 60% functional, but were received with disproportionate enthusiasm. There had been a conversation between me and my mother, a good one, better than some of the ones before, when I was still in Phoenix and still figuring out how to talk to her about things I hadn't said out loud yet. I had said some things in this conversation that I hadn't said in others, and she had been not without questions, but loving in a way that I had hoped for and was still moved by, because love you've hoped for always moves you. After I got off the phone, I sat on my bunk for a while, not unhappy, almost the opposite, full of something that didn't have a specific name, the year I'd had, the change that had come, the things I had now that I hadn't had in September. I went and found Cade. He was in the equipment room, which had become, in some ways, our room, the place we'd had that first real Sunday conversation, the place the work had always given us somewhere to exist together. He was cleaning tack with the careful attention he gave to maintenance tasks, and he looked up when I came in. I must have looked something. He straightened up and watched me. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah," I said, "really, actually, genuinely okay." He looked at me for a moment. "Your mom?" "Yeah, it was good." I sat on the workbench across from him. "Really good." He set down the tack. He looked at me with the fullness of attention that I had come to understand as one of the most specific and generous things about him, the way, when he looked at you, there was nothing held back from the looking. "Good," he said. We stayed there for a while, not working, just in the same space, the way we'd learned to be in the same space and let it be enough. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The moment happened later that evening. The whole crew was in the bunkhouse common area. It was a Friday, it was December, and there was the specific communal warmth of a group of people who have worked hard through a cold week and are now in a warm room with nowhere urgent to be. Hector had made something elaborate. Terence's broken Christmas lights were doing their partial best. There was a card game at the table, a disagreement between Marcus and Owen about something that I lost track of, Bobby reading in his corner. And then Hugh appeared at the bunkhouse door, which he didn't often do in the evenings. He usually gave the crew their space, and he had a particular look on his face that I recognized as the precursor to information that wasn't entirely welcome. He came in and waited for the room to settle, which it did quickly. Hugh Harlow's presence settled things by nature. He told us that his contact at a ranch in Colorado, a longtime friend who ran a well-regarded equine program, had offered a position. A good position. Stable management director, overseeing a large facility, real advancement, real pay. He had passed along the contact because, and here he looked at me, he thought Eli might be ready for something like this. The room was quiet. I was looking at Hugh and processing the information, the genuine opportunity of it, which was real and significant, the way an open door is real whether or not you want to walk through it. I became aware of the silence in the room in a particular way. The crew had gone quiet in the way that people go quiet when something important is happening that they don't fully have the context for. I turned, I don't know why I turned then specifically, some peripheral awareness, and looked at Cade. He was standing slightly apart from the main group, near the back wall, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not reserve, not the careful stillness. Something open and unprotected and specific, the expression of someone who has been ambushed by their own feelings in front of other people and has not yet had time to put the wall up. Everyone in the room had gone quiet. And Cade said it. Quietly, the way he said everything that mattered, not performing it for the room, saying it to me, just to me, the way everything he said that mattered went only to me. "Don't go." The bunkhouse was very still. I looked at him, he looked at me, and in the particular quality of that silence, 8 men around us going absolutely, voluntarily, deliberately still, not because they were shocked, but because they were witnessing something and they understood that, and they were giving it the space it needed. In that silence, something finally, completely arrived. Not that it hadn't been there. It had been there since the stall on a November night. but some things need to be said out loud in front of others to become fully real, and Cade Harlow, who did not perform things, who did not say things for effect, who had struggled for months to find a language for what he felt, had just said 2 words in front of 7 of the people he trusted most in the world. "Don't go." I looked at him for a long time, long enough that Bobby in his corner turned a page, quietly, deliberately, giving us all permission to breathe. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. And I meant it with every particular thing I had: the months behind us, the mornings in the stable, the November field, the December snow, the horses we'd built trust with, and the trust we'd built between us. I meant it as a statement about Colorado, which I was going to politely decline. I meant it as a statement about something much larger than a job offer. Cade held my gaze, and something crossed his face, slow, quiet, utterly real, something that I recognized as the expression of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally let it go. Terence made a sound that was somewhere between satisfaction and vindication. Hector murmured something in Spanish that sounded approving. Marcus was very conspicuously looking at the ceiling. Owen was smiling at the middle distance. "All right," Hugh said, with the composed satisfaction of a man who has spent 40 years reading situations correctly. "I'll let him know you're not available." He looked around the room. "Who wants more coffee?" The weeks between that evening and Christmas were the best weeks I'd had in as long as I could remember, which is a simple thing to say and a complicated thing to mean. What I mean is, there is a kind of ease that comes when you stop holding something, when the energy you have spent on containing and managing and carefully not saying can be redirected into just living, into the actual texture of days, the work and the cold air and the horses and the meals and the conversations. Cade and I were ourselves, the same as before and different, the same early mornings, the same fence rail in the evenings, the same work side by side. But the underneath of it had changed, the way the temperature of a room changes when the fire is properly lit rather than just smoldering. We talked in those December mornings about things we hadn't talked about before, about what we wanted, not in the grand abstract sense, but concretely, what the next year looked like, what the Double H looked like in 5 years if we were still here, whether Sable would be ready for the spring competition Hugh was considering, whether Captain needed a different feeding schedule as he aged. Small, ordinary things, the vocabulary of a shared future. One morning in the last week of December, Cade told me something he'd never told anyone on the ranch. He told me about his father, the thing he'd mentioned once and never returned to. He told it quietly and without drama, looking at the horses, and I listened the same way. I didn't try to fix it or minimize it or match it with a story of my own. I just received it, and when he was done, I put my hand on his arm for a moment, briefly, just briefly, but with full intention, and he looked at me with those amber eyes and nodded once. That was all, that was enough. Some things don't need to be made larger than they are. Some things need to just be held gently and set in the light and allowed to be what they are. That's what those mornings were. Christmas Eve on a working ranch is a specific, particular thing. The work doesn't stop, the horses don't know it's a holiday, the cattle don't care, but it softens. The day has a quality to it, especially with the snow down and the light coming low and golden through the stable windows, that makes even the routine feel ceremonial. Linda Harlow had transformed the farmhouse into something genuinely beautiful, and she'd fed the entire crew a dinner that left everyone sitting with the slow satisfaction of people who have been well looked after. There was pie. There was something Hector had contributed that nobody asked about too closely, but that warmed you from the inside out. After dinner, most of the crew stayed in the farmhouse for the evening, cards, conversation, Hugh and Linda's Christmas music on an old radio that only got 2 stations clearly but did its best. I went back to the stables for the last check of the night. It had become one of my favorite things about this life, the nighttime stable, the horses settled, the quiet that was full rather than empty. Cade came, of course. We moved through the stalls together in the lantern light, the last check of the last evening of a year that had been, in almost every way that mattered, a transformation. I thought about September, the pre-dawn truck ride, the unfamiliar darkness of the Montana morning, the stranger at the end of the stable who looked at me with those amber eyes and said you worked with therapy horses in a tone that reserved judgment. I looked at that man now, in the lantern light of Sable's stall, his hand on the filly's neck, his hat pushed back, his expression open in the way it had become open since we stopped pretending the space between us was ordinary. "What?" he said, catching me looking. "Nothing," I said, "just this." He looked at me, understood, nodded. We finished the check. We walked out of the stable into the Christmas Eve night, cold, clear, the snow on the ground reflecting back the stars, the farmhouse windows glowing, the low sound of voices and music coming from inside. We stood together outside the stable door, close, shoulders touching, looking up at the sky. "Still don't regret it," he said. His voice was quiet, light in a way it had learned to be. "Coming here. Coming here." I looked at the sky. I thought about Phoenix and 11 hours of driving and one name on a piece of paper. I thought about Captain's skeptical appraisal on the first morning. I thought about Sable shaking in a storm and learning not to shake anymore. I thought about a fence rail at dusk. I thought about a November field and 2 words said in honesty and 2 words said in a bunkhouse and the particular quality of a silence that 8 people give you as a gift. "Not for one single second," I said. His shoulder was warm against mine in the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a horse called out, low and satisfied, settling for the night. "Good," he said. And we stood there under the Montana stars, and the year turned, and everything was simply, fully, completely good. Epilogue: what the horses know. There is a thing that horses understand that takes people much longer to learn. They understand that trust is not a single moment. It is not the first time you extend your hand and they come to it. It is not the storm they survive with you, or the obstacle they clear, or the fear they move through. Those are all part of it, but trust is the accumulation of all of them, day over day, morning over morning, the steady, reliable presence of someone who shows up and stays and does not flinch at the difficult parts. Sable knows this now. Captain knows it. Duchess has known it for 17 years. Rio is learning it, the particular stubborn way he learns everything, but he's getting there. I know it too. I know it the way you know the things that are taught to you not by instruction, but by experience, in your hands and your body and your habits, as permanent as anything you'll ever carry. Cade Harlow taught me some of it, without meaning to teach me anything. He taught me that patience is not the same as waiting, that stillness is not the same as absence, that the hardest things, the ones you've buried and unnamed and carried alone in the dark, are the ones most worth the care it takes to finally bring them into the light. And I know this. On a cold December morning in Montana, when the stable is quiet and the horses are warm and the man beside me is close enough that I can feel the steadiness of him without touching, in those mornings, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I am home. Spring came to the Double H with the specific Montana extravagance of springs in high country, fast and overwhelming and too beautiful to look at directly. Sable ran her first cattle work trial in April and executed it with a composure that made Hugh stand at the fence in silence for a full 30 seconds afterward, which was, from Hugh, approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Rio still tests people. Some things are constants. Bobby turned 60 in March. Hector made a cake of such ambition that we talked about it for weeks. Gil, who we had all assumed was constitutionally incapable of participating in birthday celebrations, quietly contributed the exact brand of whiskey that Bobby preferred. Nobody commented on this. Bobby accepted it with a nod. Marcus got his first promotion. He's handling cattle lead now, and he's genuinely good at it. The impatience has mostly converted into speed, which is different. And on the east fence rail, every evening when the day's work is done and the light is going gold over the mountains, 2 men sit together and watch the horses move in the last light, quiet, unhurried, close, and the land holds them the way land holds everything it has witnessed, with patience and without judgment, and for as long as they choose to stay. The end.
That is the story, all of it. The dust and the down and the stable boy who came from somewhere else and found something he did not know he was looking for. But there is what I want to know. Did you see it coming the moment in the bunkhouse? Or were you as caught off guard as Eli was? Drop your answer in the comment right now. I saw it coming or didn't see it coming. And tell me which moment hit you the hardest. If this story moved you the way I think did it. If you felt something in the November field or the storm or that quiet don't go, then you already know. Because the question is not whether Eli and Kate's story continues. Thanks for watching and keep watching. Subscribe, comment, and like, and keep watching for the new upcoming LGBTQ stories.